Hello everybody, this is Alex Honnold. I am doing another Instagram Live this week. It's not a specific Honnold Foundation Live. I'm actually going to be chatting with an environmental journalist named Amanda Little from World War Zero. And let's see, I'm going to turn off request to go live. And I will invite her to join me. As always, it's a chat about environmental issues, but in a slightly different way. So here. Okay, I've invited her. Oh, you made it. But, in a slightly different way. Well, you're getting, I was getting weird feedback off that. Do you, Oh, you made it. Wait, kill your computer if you still have a computer open.
Killed it.
Oh,
Is that
cool.
good?
Yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Thank you for the amazing introduction to Instagram Live. I appreciate that.
No, my pleasure, my pleasure. So why don't you do a quick intro of who, you're an environmental journalist. What are we going to be talking about today, and then guide us into it.
Yeah, so Alex, I am a professor of environmental journalism at Vanderbilt, and I write for Bloomberg about climate and food and energy, and a great fan of yours and delighted to be here. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
No, my pleasure.
I feel like it's crucial to certainly want to talk about substantive issues like solar and climate and your foundation. But the question that feels most pressing to me right now is what everybody needs to be asked, which is, how are you?
I'm good. I mean, in case you can't tell, I just left my garage, so I've been training all morning. I went for a little mountain bike ride this morning. I'm great. I actually, honestly, once I saw myself on the live, I was like, oh, I should have showered. but I didn't have time. I just finished training. So,
well, I'm glad to see the chalk still on your fingers. That you have the sure grip. And I think I've read that you just got married. Mazel tov.
Yeah, I got it.
At a time when oh, there it is. There
yeah.
it is. I got my marriage to vote. So we're well paired here.
Yeah.
And of course, we know it needs not to be overstated, but maybe it does, that our country is facing a pandemic and raging wildfires and racial injustice and political turmoil. And we're facing the most consequential election in U.S. history, possibly. I'm wondering how you're handling it all.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think I keep it in perspective a little bit. There are only a handful of things that I can affect, which is doing lives like this, chatting about things, like advocating for the things that I care about. And beyond that, it's sort of out of my control. And so all I can really do is go in my garage and train and try to be the best climber that I can be. To some extent, it is the will of the people. You know what I mean? Like I can do my best to do meaningful things, but beyond that, you're sort of like, you do have to let people decide, let people vote, and just, see how it plays out. I don't know. Actually, though, it's funny when you mention that we're in sort of consequential times, that there are multiple crises facing us. What's funny is that all of those crises can kind of be managed in the same way, which is, massive investment in renewables or like green infrastructure type projects. It's funny because they all sort of, we're like, oh, there's so many disasters hitting us at the same time. And you're kind of like, thankfully, they all have a common solution that threads through them. It's like, why don't we actually invest in that? And it's like weird that nobody in the public space, or well, obviously some people in the public space are talking about those kinds of solutions, but it's definitely not considered like a go-to solution in the US, which I think is crazy.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail. You've definitely identified that it's the best of times and the worst of times. We're focused a lot on the worst of times, but so often solutions accompany real pain and pressure, and so we're seeing both.
That's like the classic. That's the classic having to hit rock bottom before you start actually implementing change in your life. It's like maybe this is America hitting rock bottom.
Yes, that is true. And I think a lot about that scene in Free Solo when the neurologist determined that you have a hypoactive or like a very mellow amygdala. and I think that must come in really handy at a time when so much of our country is entering this deepening state of fear.
Well, so what do you mean? Like, what do you mean?
Well, I mean that you know you have an amazing amount of courage. You're you know widely celebrated for your bravery and in terms of physical acts of risk, and you've also taken on some great challenges with your foundation, and you're fighting a bigger cause. So yeah, I think a lot of people really admire you for your courage. And we're in a time when a lot of people are really overwhelmed with anxiety and fear. I know they're very different, how you feel on, you know, a rock wall versus how you feel facing, you know, climate change and pandemic and so on. But it's on my mind a lot. It's like, wow, I sometimes wish my amygdala was, you know, my fight or flight instinct firing.
Though actually the difference between that sort of physical courage and dealing with anxiety is not as big of a difference as you might think. I mean, a lot of it just has to do with preparing for something as much as you can. And then beyond that, like sort of letting it go. I mean, what's the, it's like I rarely quote the Bible or anything. What's the Lord's Prayer or whatever? Like, give me the grace to, you know, change what I can and the serenity to accept the things that I can't. Whatever that, do you know what I'm saying? It's been a long time since I went to Sunday school.
I'm also not very, but something like the courage to accept, the wisdom to accept what I can't change, and the courage to know the difference.
Yeah, exactly. But that's kind of the thing is that, you know, it's like you do like, and kind of what I was just saying is like the reason I'm relatively relaxed about it all is I know that there are only a handful of things that I can actually do, and I'm doing those things, and I feel comfortable with that. And beyond that, I have to just let it play out. You know. You take a deep breath and let it play out.
Exactly. Yeah. Let it play out. And also, I mean, it must be also, it's so important to have a real balance between the amount of time you spend in your head and the amount of time you spend in your body. I mean, I'm a professor and a journalist, and I find that I spend way too much time in my head, and things feel a lot more solvable when I'm in my body, you know, and so it gives us a sense of, you know, completion of like single acts a day, picking up the wall, you know, you feel like you can get stuff done if things feel more manageable. So with that in mind, tell me about the Honnold Foundation. I think you founded it in 2012 or 13, is that right?
Yeah, something like that. Honestly, I don't remember either, actually, but yeah, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and we founded it, and I initially founded it just to support environmental projects however I could. Basically, in a general sense, I wanted to do something useful for the planet. And over the years, that's evolved into supporting solar projects specifically for a more equitable world. And so we've always sort of split our work globally and domestically, just because the projects abroad often have a bigger humanitarian impact, but the projects domestically typically have a bigger environmental impact. You can you know, offset more carbon with grid-tied projects domestically. And so yeah, I mean, basically it's just, you know, I felt like I needed to do something useful, and solar, like basically helping the world transition to renewables as quickly as possible, seemed like the most useful thing that I could help in.
And how did you learn about that? I mean, you know, we hear certainly a lot about the enormous growth of solar, the economies of scale that have brought the cost down. I mean, this is an amazing time to be involved in bringing solar to the people in the real sense, instead of just, you know, fancy office buildings. But tell me about the timing. I mean, it seems like your foundation has really evolved as the industry itself has evolved. And as I understand, since 2012 or 2010, I think the solar industry has grown 50% a year. I mean, it's just incredible growth, which then makes it a lot easier for you to do your work because the costs come down.
Yeah, because it's cheaper. Yeah, it's actually not so much that that the foundation has evolved. It's just that we're able to do more because it's so much cheaper. You know, it's like, you know, we're still funding the same kinds of projects. We're still working with the same kinds of people. We're just able to do it at a bigger scale because the cost has gone down so much. You know, we're just able to deploy more solar, which is great. I mean, that's kind of the direction that the world's going and the direction the world has to go.
Can you tell me more about the growth over time of your projects? Like, how many households are you reaching? Some just examples of some of the projects that have really fired you up?
Well, so, yes, I mean, just in the broadest sense, when I started the foundation in 2012 or 13, I started donating 50 grand a year to the foundation, which at the time was like a third of my income. But I was living in a car and it felt pretty casual. I was like, oh, 50K seemed like enough to have a meaningful difference on some community. And that was generally split into sort of two grants for two different types of projects. This year, the Honnold Foundation will be donating about $1 million spread across a whole slew of different types of community projects. I mean, basically, we're doing 20 times the work that we were 8 years ago, which to me is a huge, it's pretty exciting. And actually, and it's not even just fair to say 20 times the work, because as we just said, the cost of solar has gone down so much that that's probably actually like 30 times the amount of panels being installed. But
yeah, I want to get a little bit more into the details of that work, but first some context for this. It's so relevant in terms of course, climate and air quality. And climate first, we're in Climate Week right now. We have fires raging in California. This week we heard that the smoke was reaching the East Coast. Even Europe, I think, was has evidence of the impacts of those fires. We've seen hurricanes that are building intensity in the Atlantic. There's a lot going on in terms of climate change.
yeah,
How do you process climate change? What concerns you the most about it? What makes you most hopeful?
that's yeah. I mean that's the huge, like, I don't know. I mean, the thing that concerns me the most is exactly what you're describing. I just spent the last month. I'm in Lake Tahoe, California. Choked in smoke, and that's unfortunate. That's that's an irritation for sure. But the thing that really concerns me about it is that I've spent my entire life spending summers up here. And, in 35 years of being in this one place, I've never experienced anything like that. And when you set records every single summer, it just kind of gives a sense, like basically when your experiences in nature are constantly new, like brand new, like this has never happened, like this is crazy. It's pretty unsettling because
Yeah.
Through pretty much all of human history, we've taken the climate mostly for granted, that it will remain relatively stable. Like obviously there are periods of drought, there are periods of cold, but overall over, tens of thousands of years, the climate's been like relatively, maybe not 10, because I suppose the last ice age retreated 10,000 years ago. But I mean, when you talk about climate spread over 10,000 years, and then you're sort of like, oh, in the last 5, it's gone totally crazy. You're like,
Yeah.
That's alarming to me, like that's, yeah,
I
it's
feel like,
concerning.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I'm just like, yeah, now I'm all stressed. I'm like, oh, geez, it's concerning.
Well, I mean, I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about I've been reporting on climate for 20 plus years. The first IPCC report came out in 2000. I mean, that really hit the public. Of course, there were scientists and politicians talking about it for decades before that. But we've, 20 years we've been talking about this thing looming in the future. And it feels like in the last, certainly few years, but even in the last few months, it feels like it's here and so present. It's this
Totally.
thing imagining is very much in
Totally.
our midst.
I want to go on a little aside here because as somebody who spends most of my time in the mountains, I feel like, well, and I think there's legitimate science behind this. Basically, like mountains experience climate change at a greater rate. Like you see glaciers recede faster, you see snowfall, or like a snow base, like a snow pack, starting at higher elevations. So like in a place like Tahoe here, like I have family photos from my grandpa built the cabin that I'm in 1949. So my whole family grew up spending time here. And so I have family photos of my father's family digging their way into the cabin under 20 feet of snow, like totally outrageous.
Wow.
And nowadays, you can't even imagine that. Like you can go mountain biking in the winter. There are winters where it basically doesn't snow. And the snow pack, like the base, extends down to 7,000 feet. Like basically, you can only go skiing above 7,000 feet now. And the lake's at 6.2. And so, you're kind of like, oh, there's now this like 800-foot, like 1,000-foot dead zone where it like just doesn't really collect enough snow to ski, which is crazy because there's ski areas all around here. And so I think that when you're living in these kinds of places, you just see it so much more readily. And I think that a lot of climate change denial is kind of, basically, I think that if you live in a city, it's a little bit easier to just not really take the natural environment into regard because, well, I had to just pause my thing. But basically, I think that when you live in cities, it's easier to be disconnected from nature. But when you're actually out in the mountains all the time, it's hard not to see how quickly the world is changing.
Yeah, it's pretty staggering, and you made me think of Sarah Cooper's video that she just published with World War Zero this week, about Trump's climate denial, and she's lip syncing an interaction between Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes and President Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And she opens with this explanation. He opens with this explanation of why he's not addressing climate change, and he says something like, "I don't want to lose millions and millions of jobs." Which is just so deeply at odds with the reality you're addressing, which is that, in fact,
totally,
there so many of the solutions create millions and millions of jobs. But
mm-hmm.
but again, before we get back to the solar thing, how do you deal with climate denialism? Do you encounter that, and how do you talk to people in your community?
I don't know. I think that like with most contentious issues, I feel like it's always better to appeal to values. Like what do people really care about? Because I think most people, so climate denial in the US is like spread out across the spectrum, I think. And part of it is just from people believing whatever their political team tells them. But the thing is that I think like when you talk to an individual and you're like, look, do you plant things in your garden? Like, have you experienced crushing heat the last couple of years? Like, have you had smoked over skies for the first time in your entire life that you can remember? I mean, the thing is that even climate deniers are still humans that still live in the physical world, So it's pretty easy to still appeal to, there's so many clear observable signs that, you can still talk about those. And so I think a lot of people deny climate change mostly because they're worried about the economic impact. They're worried about, what it would take to mitigate climate change. But I think that you can kind of get past some of that and be like, but look, like, are you concerned about the world that your kids will grow up in? And I think, the majority of Americans answer yes to that question. They're like, yeah, it is concerning. It's just, being able to lay out good solutions for them that don't alarm them. I think that's the crux.
Right. And with the focus on, on solar, for example, that story is about job creation. I mean, it's also about a loss of coal jobs and displacing certain industries and building new ones. And it's hard to talk about, but
though I think the important thing there is that it's not like renewables are displacing old energy, like displacing fossil fuels, like out of spite or out of malice. It's like they are actually just cheaper and more efficient. And, I don't know. I read your piece on renewables, like that the U.S. should double down on renewables, and the graphic that was included in it with solar having something like 700,000 jobs and coal having like 170,000 jobs in the U.S. It's like, people don't really know those numbers. Like when you listen to politicians, they talk about like preserving coal jobs, and you're kind of like, coal jobs are a tiny fraction of the jobs in renewables right now, but nobody's really broadcasting that quite the same way.
Yeah, solar in that piece, I think I said solar and wind sectors alone outnumber coal jobs in coal and gas jobs in 30 states. And I don't think that is a reality that people know. Now, at the same time, there is very legitimate concern around the job loss in fossil fuel industries that are phasing out, flaming out for reasons not necessarily because of wind and solar, but because they're no longer sustainable for any number of reasons. From an air pollution and particulates standpoint, from a carbon standpoint, they no longer make economic sense for a lot of reasons. So it's not, I don't mean to say it's the fault of solar and wind that we're losing these jobs. I also think we need to honor and acknowledge that there is a lot of pain in the transition away from a fossil fuel economy and to a renewable economy.
Though that kind of pain can be mitigated in certain ways. I mean, like the Honnold Foundation is supporting this organization called Coalfield Development that basically does exactly that. I mean, they try to help retrain former coal workers and provide jobs for them or their family, in the new industries. But the thing is, I think that the fact that a transition will be difficult is not a reason to not take that transition. It's like stagecoach drivers didn't want to lose their jobs in the early 1900s, but it's like, I'm glad I'm not riding a stagecoach today. You know what I mean? And like steam engine operators didn't want to lose their jobs in like the late 1800s or whatever. But it's like, I'm glad that all of our freight isn't transported by steam engine. I'm kind of like, the world changes, and we may as well embrace the solutions that work better and just move forward with them.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement. I wrote a book called The Fate of Food, What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, Smarter World. And I was an energy reporter for a long time, and I transitioned into agriculture and food, in large part because there's a lot of overlap, right? There's, a big consumer of energy and a big producer of CO2. But a lot of I encountered a lot of what you're talking about with when interviewing farmers, and I went to 13 countries and 18 states to report this book. And very often when I would talk to food producers about transitioning to, sustainable food systems, and about their concerns about climate pressures, they would respond in a similar way to, many of the, coal families that I've interviewed, which is, a resistance to a climate discussion, but a reality, facing the reality that we are at a critical, pivotal point, right? Like they're seeing pressures, farmers more than probably anyone are feeling the pressures of climate change on their livelihoods. And they're really motivated to figure out how to become resilient. But associating it with climate change is difficult, right? It feels like it's intimidating, and they say, well, that's not a scientist. Yeah.
When that's probably partially because the term has sort of been co-opted by politics, and because it's like they feel like they're on a certain team and they don't want to let their team down by acknowledging that climate change is a very real challenge that they need to be facing. But they're kind of like, oh, but yeah, it's funny because when you're talking about farmers, that's exactly what I was just describing about people in the mountains, like, where I'm doing all my outdoor recreation. It's like, if you're a farmer, you're living on the same piece of land, you're seeing it change season over season, possibly for generations. It's like, the land super well, and that it's changing. It's like when you see flowers bloom at like a month sooner or a month later, you're like, that's weird. Like my grandma didn't plant their flowers at that time. And it's like, I think that connection with the land is something that when you live in a city is easy to overlook. But if you're a farmer, if you're a mountain athlete, it's like, you see it every day.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I would try to get the farmers. They could tell me exactly what the rainfall had been for the last 60 years on their land, and the trend over time, and the shifting seasons, and the impacts of freezes on their crops, and all of the vulnerabilities they were facing. And the response was, I know that the conditions are changing. I do not know that this is climate change.
That's classic. Like they're basically all doing climate science. I mean, that is climate science.
That's right. It was very moving, actually. So you focused not just on the climate benefits of solar, but also air quality. And I love this quote of yours. You said the realities that in the United States, to focus on environmental issues like air quality and particulate pollution, is to focus on BIPOC communities. Let's explore this intersection of environmental solutions and environmental justice. You have really made that central to your mission. Tell me about that and your commitment to that and how that's evolved.
I mean, yeah. So, yeah. I mean, like how should we just fully dive into it? I mean, it's kind of interesting because the executive director of my foundation is much more concerned with social justice than I am. Like I've always cared more about environmental issues in a broader sense, because basically I feel like if the natural world disintegrates, human communities are all going to suffer, And so, but it's been interesting because as we work with the foundation, it's kind of like a yin and yang where I'm always pushing the environmental side. She's always pushing more of the social justice side, making sure that the projects that we support benefit the right communities and help the right people, or like help people who can use it the most. And, so we just launched this program called that we're calling the Community Fund, which is basically to put solar on BIPOC-led nonprofits around the US. And we're sort of focusing on the most polluted areas. And to me, it made sense to focus on, the most environmentally degraded areas of the US. Like basically, always start where there's the most need. But in this case, when you look at the most polluted areas of the U.S., they're pretty much all BIPOC communities. And that's like the environmental justice component that.
And low-income white communities, but
yeah.
It's true. All low-income.
So when you take out Appalachia, there are not that many low-income white communities hideously affected by air pollution. I don't know. I mean, basically, Yeah, I mean, so we just found that there's so much overlap that we're like, oh, we may as well just make this project specifically, and it seems more fair to basically help lift up, BIPOC-led nonprofits because they're already doing work in their communities, may as well help them do that work better. But um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's one of those things that I think that when you like, I grew up in suburban California, it's easy to like never think about those kinds of issues because you're just like, oh, everybody just like lives in a house in the suburbs, it's totally chill. And then when you actually look at it, you're just like, oh, that's like grossly unfair. That's like that's not the world that we want to live in. That's not the world I want to live in. And it doesn't seem appropriate at all to have, like kids next to like going to school next to big like shipping corridors and things where it's like there's tons of particulate from trucks going by nonstop. It's like, like who wants to live in that world?
Yeah. And the thing that makes me most hopeful on climate right now is the way that youth climate activists are transforming the movement. I mean, they're really making climate solutions inextricable from social justice solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Was not true of the climate of climate activism even 10 years ago.
Totally.
And today I think there are climate strikes across the world with a focus on MAPA, on most affected people in areas. I just feel like it's so important. Your organization is now among this sort of real shift in the way we're thinking and talking about climate. We cannot solve the climate issue if it's not fundamentally human, if it is not a human issue, if it is not a moral imperative issue, if it is a justice issue.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I mean that's exactly the rationale that was behind my foundation to begin with, is that I was like, there's no point in supporting environmental projects that don't also improve standard of living, that don't also help people. Because, I've been on enough climate expeditions to parts of the world where to some parts of the world where people are living, as they did 10,000 years ago, basically like herding goats in the desert, just like full, as rustic as one can imagine. And, when you travel through communities like that, you realize that like they would happily cut down the last tree on earth if it means boiling water for their family that night. And as they should, you know what I mean? They're making ends meet. They're just surviving. And I'm sort of like, man, you can't begrudge them like felling all the trees in their community because you're kind of like, they're doing what they need to do. The key is to help lift them out of poverty, basically help them meet their needs in a more sustainable way. I don't know. Basically, there's just no point in working on environmental issues that don't also address the massive human need across the planet. But.
And for so long, though, it was about these far-flung wilderness areas that were really not relevant to a lot of the U.S. population, right? It was even, the places that you love so well, the national parks and, which are so crucial to the beauty of our country and the identity of our country, but also very inaccessible to a lot of Americans and especially urban Americans. And so the conversational shift toward, climate is a human issue. We're not, yes, we need to save the endangered fairy shrimp, that lives, or, the polar bear. But really we need to save our communities, and we need to save the people who are deeply affected, who are losing their homes, who are losing their livelihoods, who are losing their cultural traditions. And I mean, by the way, keep fairy shrimp alive. But that is a crucial transition and a crucial broadening of the discussion.
Totally. Yeah, I think the broadening of the coalition is the key. It's just like hard to get people to care if it doesn't affect their lives. And so you need to help people realize that it affects all of our lives. And I think that this year especially, it's much easier to see how it's affecting your life. Because like with the entire West Coast unable to go outside because of smoke, it's easy to see the impacts of climate change, more readily.
Yeah, you said at the beginning of this conversation that you had yourself been dealing with this choking smoke in the air. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, this is affecting your own livelihood, right? Like if you can't breathe, clean-ish air, you can't do what you love.
Well, so it's not even just the air. So they also closed national forests in all of California, so all the public land. So I'm in Tahoe. The entire Tahoe Basin is Forest Service land, basically. So all the trailheads, all the climbing areas, like basically access to everything around here is closed, which I totally understand and respect because, firefighting, basically firefighters are stretched so thin that they can't really risk more people in the backcountry potentially starting a fire. it makes sense that resources are spread out too far. The whole state's on fire. Like I can give up recreation for a little bit. Though I did actually read the specific rules around it, and it did say that if you're engaged in commerce, you're still allowed to travel on Forest Service. And I was like, well, as a professional athlete, am I still allowed to go train in the mountains? But I didn't try. I was like, we'll just see. But between the actual air quality and everything being closed, it does feel stifling. You're sort of like, oh, like mountain communities, like resort towns, like places that rely on outdoor tourism, and outdoor tourism, or sort of the outdoor recreation economy, is a huge driver of the U.S. economy. I mean, I think it's like $800 billion a year in the U.S. spent on outdoor recreation. And so when that whole spigot gets turned off because there are too many fires, that's a big deal for America. And communities like South Lake Tahoe like feel that.
Yeah. I'm thinking again about one of your earlier points, and the intersection of your role as a professional athlete, and the risks you take in that role, and your role as an activist and a civic hero, and a solar advocate. I know you're a very humble person and don't see yourself probably as a civic hero, but you mentioned that the kind of way in which you inure yourself and build courage in your physical life really informs the way that you approach the rest of your life. Sorry, loud dog. How can you tell me about a bit more about that? Because I really admire that.
Well, I think, so yeah, with big climbing challenges, when you're trying to do something really scary as a climber, the best way to manage it is basically to prepare, to train, to physically prepare, to practice, like to get ready until it's less scary, like until, it's interesting because with rock climbing, it's hard to quantify a lot of those kinds of things. There are certain climbs you just look at a wall and you're like, that seems really, really scary. But then after, months of training, years of training, whatever it takes, eventually you'll look at that wall and think, that looks amazing. Like that looks really fun. That looks, exciting. And so, it's hard to quantify exactly like when something will feel scary or not, but I think that the process is the same even for non-climbing endeavors, is basically to prepare for things, to put the effort in, to put the time. Like if something feels like a really scary and daunting issue, perhaps the way to make it feel less daunting is to dive into it, understand more of it, basically take the actions that you can. It's funny, like, so when I started my foundation that same year, basically I'd read way too many books like you've written about climate and energy and energy systems. And actually I ordered your book about food. I get it in a couple days. But, I'd read I'd read way too many books about that kind of thing. And I was starting to feel, sort of like crushing existential anxiety of like, oh no, in my lifetime, the world is basically going to burn. I was like, this is crazy. And so I sort of enumerated the things that I could do as an individual, which, is change my diet. I went vegetarian, sort of trending towards vegan, because that's much lower impact. I changed my bank because that's another easy thing that an individual can do, to make sure that their money isn't being used to finance fossil fuel projects. And then I was going to start offsetting all my travel. But then at the time, say 8 or 9 years ago, when I was looking into it, it made more sense for me to start the foundation and basically fund projects that would have been carbon offsets anyway, but we're having a more meaningful human impact. Like basically, I wanted to make sure that if I was offsetting my travel, it was in a way that was useful for communities. And so, sort of, this was all kind of a New Year's resolution, like the year changed, and I was like, okay, I'm like going to take all these actions. And honestly, I've slept pretty well since. I'm sort of like, okay, I'm doing the things, like I am living in line with my values. And not to say that that's going to be enough to keep the world from burning, but like, I feel like I can't necessarily do much more. And so, now I relax and go train in my garage.
I love that. And it makes me think of something that the head of my kids' school said, because there are a lot of kids dealing with anxiety. And he said, the antidote to anxiety in children, but humans generally, is not necessarily relaxation and it's a sense of purpose, right? Mm-hmm. Like what actually gets us through fear and anxiety is a sense of purpose. It's the most, there's no better way to settle the nervous system.
Yeah, or more than just purpose, agency, like feeling like you have some control over your life and you can take action in a way that will help.
Yeah.
Which is tied in very closely to purpose, but is like slightly different, like actually being able to do something.
Right. And so even those little steps, as you say, if it's, changing your bank or, there's a lot of concern. People think, does it matter? Does my little action matter? And it does, because it accumulates into
Totally.
a sense of agency, a sense of purpose, and eventually
Totally.
willingness to show up at the voting booth and become a civic leader.
Dude, so sort of random anecdote along those lines. So yesterday I walked to the grocery store, and on the way home, there was like some litter, by the fence that I was going through. And I was sort of like, oh, it's too bad there's litter. And then I was like, wait, I could just pick up the litter and then there won't be litter anymore. So I like picked up a bunch of trash from this little area and like strolled home, felt really good about myself. And it was interesting because I was sort of thinking about it as I walked home, because, I know that in the grand scheme of things, picking up some trash makes no difference in, the global environmental system. On the other hand, I was like, it did make me feel good about myself, and it sort of empowered me to take other positive action in my life. And it was in line with my values. I was like, this is the correct thing to do. I have acted correctly, and that empowers me to hopefully go out and take other correct action. And so, I was like, oh, there is something to be said for even the smallest steps, as long as they're a step in the right direction, is still useful.
Yeah, I love that. It really feels like very relevant. The small act feels very relevant to the big act. In fact, the big acts can't happen without the small.
Exactly.
So, speaking of those little kind of steps toward progress, and I know we only have 10 minutes left here, but what are the biggest barriers you've faced in your advocacy of solar at the Honnold Foundation? What is the sort of El Capitan of your your civic action life? What has been the biggest challenge, and how have you moved through that?
Yeah, so there are kind of two things to that. So I would say the LCAP would be, the whole world going 100%, or at least the whole country going 100% renewables. That seems to be like the impossible goal of having the country go totally powered by renewables. On the other hand, that's not exactly the LCAP, because that almost surely will happen within the next 50 years. It's just a matter of how quickly it happens and whether or not it helps us avoid the worst of climate change. But I mean, and honestly, to me, that's one of the most frustrating things about climate change, is that all of the solutions to prevent climate change are all going to happen in the next century anyway, because they're more efficient, they're more cost effective. It's just better, like driving electric cars is nicer. It's like all these solutions will be implemented, but it's like, if they happen in 100 years, all of our coastal cities will flood. If they happen in 20 years, we might still be able to enjoy going outdoors in the summer. And I'm kind of like, it's like, when that all the solutions are going to happen anyway, why not just do them sooner? Like, that drives me crazy. But, but no, when you talk about so your actual question was about the biggest challenge to solar advocacy. And I've never considered myself an advocate for anything. And I think that's actually an important distinction sort of with the foundation, is that we've always sort of prided ourselves in just going out and doing the work, like not so much advocating for it, not so much talking about it. At a certain point, you just have to go and install panels. Like, the work just has to get done. And so I've kind of always measured success with the Honnold Foundation as, have we executed these projects, and have the projects actually meaningfully improve people's lives? And beyond that, it's like, and that's kind of why I love the work that we're doing so much, is that it's really satisfying, because like each project you do, something has physically changed in the world. Like, you've actually gone out and done something.
And so what are the barriers in doing that work? I mean, in actually getting the solar, is it funding? Is it, is working in grid tied cities or regions? Is it dealing with the with the utilities? Like, what are the challenges
right now, at the scale that we're operating, the biggest challenge is funding, for sure. I mean, we're giving away $1 million in grants this year. We could easily be doing 5 or 10 million in grants and supporting the same kinds of projects in the same communities. I think that if we were operating at like the scale of the Gates Foundation or something, where we had like billions of dollars to deploy into renewables, then we would start having to worry about, like utility scale. Like, it's just totally different scale. Then we'd have to worry about governance and just like, legality. And I don't know, I'm sure we'd be like trying to build high transmission lines and things like that. But no, at our scale, like basically at a community scale, the main question is funding. It's like if we had more money, we would put it into better projects, or put it into more projects anyway.
And can you just repeat for all of us? I'm sure you're, a lot of the people in your community know this, but the total kind of achievements to date of your of the foundation and your efforts, like in megawatts or number of houses, or.
So it's funny you asked. Like, so I actually don't think we have a running tally of any kind of megawatts installed, community served. I mean, I could like run through a handful of the most meaningful projects off the top of my head. But part of the reason that we've never explicitly quantified that kind of thing is because we've always combined, off-grid projects in rural Africa with, grid-tied projects in suburban California. And so it's really hard to compare that kind of thing because a grid-tied project in California can cost $10,000 or $20,000, whereas an off-grid, I mean, you could basically equip an entire village in rural Africa for $10,000 or $20,000, and it would have an incredible impact on quality of life. People would suddenly have light in their home for the first time. They'd be able to charge their cell phones without having to walk, 5-6 miles to a kiosk and then pay somebody to charge their phone for them. I mean, basically, like, you really can't overstate the human impact of energy access in certain parts of the world. And so I think that with the Honnold Foundation, it's hard to sort of it's hard to combine those types of projects, because they're just vastly different. It's like putting a 50-watt panel, like a single 50-watt panel onto somebody's roof versus, like a 4.5 kilowatt system on a suburban home. It's, and yet the 50-watt panel will have a bigger impact on that person's life because they'll be able to see after dark for the first time in their whole life, basically.
Yeah. And do you have have you been there when you've seen that happen? Can you share a moment in the final minutes of just watching that extraordinary?
No, it's totally incredible. I mean, a big part of why I started the Honnold Foundation and why I cared about energy access is because there's something like 1 billion people on Earth right now without access to power, which is totally crazy because when you grow up in the US, you just take electricity for granted. But so, of that 1 billion people, sort of the majority of them are in equatorial regions, which means that it's dark for 12 hours a day, which is something else that when you're growing up in the Northern Hemisphere, you don't think about that much. But when you're at the equator, you have 12 hours light, 12 hours of dark. And so if you have no access to power, that means that 1/2 of every day is basically unproductive for your entire lifespan, which is crazy because, I mean, I don't know, when you think of like what it took for like my education, getting up early, getting ready to go to school, and then like reading after dark and like all these things, like it's hard to do any of that without access to power. So that was part of why I started the foundation. So when you ask about specifics of, we did this project in Angola, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. It was a North Face expedition. It was covered by Vice. There's actually a video of it online. It was all pretty cool. And so we were climbing in this new area, no one had ever climbed there, cool granite domes, like nice routes. And then we were equipping solar panels on this neighboring village, like sort of adjacent to the climbing. And, full rural Angolan community, no power, some kerosene lanterns. Anyway, we did one system, basically just so that the Vice guys could film it. Like the whole deployment was going to be going on like after we left. There was a whole like market-based approach to it where people would be selling them, and like it was all much more sustainable. But we installed one system just so that the guys from Vice could film it for this like video we're making. And so it was like 150-watt panel, 4 LED light bulbs, and a little battery that you could charge from. And so there was this guy, his 2 daughters living on either side of him. It's like basically a single room hut with 2 single room huts on either side. And so this one little panel put 3 LED bulbs into the 3 huts and then 1 bulb sitting outside. And so we came back after dark, and literally the whole village was congregated around these 3 homes because it's the only source of light in maybe 30 miles in any direction, maybe 40 miles. And there are no roads either. So that represents like a tremendous distance. And so, we're like, it's pretty magical. You see the whole village come out. People are all hanging out. And you feel safer because, you can actually see each other. I mean, it was pretty crazy. And it's like, a father, his 2 daughters, their kids, it's like probably represents like a family of 12 or 15 or something total when you combine like the different groups of folks living in the different huts. And you're like, I don't know. I mean, you can't overstate how big of an impact that has on this family of 15,
Yeah.
I mean,
and to think that also the the energy was produced by the most elegant process, right?
Totally. Totally.
It's material that's able to convert photons to electrons. I mean, it's so elemental. It's so essential to the way that, plants grow, and like
Totally.
so essential to the power of nature.
Well, and in that kind of a community, it feels like when you're saying it's such a elemental solution, it also feels like a very elegant solution somewhere like that, because realistically, they're never going to be transmission lines. Like no one's ever going to run the grid out there, because it'll never be cost effective, because nobody has an income. Like nobody's going to be paying for power to be shipped into places like that, because that's okay. Say hi to your child. But basically, it's like some communities on Earth will never have the money required to run transmission lines to them. And yet for the cost of a tiny solar panel, you can get, not the full benefit, because obviously you can't like run a fridge off it. You can't, but you can get, a lot of the benefit of electricity that way. I don't know. No, it's incredibly satisfying work to be there and to actually see it implemented and see the human impact that it can have.
Well, you're leaving me with many more questions, and we've already shot past our time limit here. But Alex, what a pleasure to connect with you. It's really just a great honor to connect. And I guess one last just kind of shout out to everybody listening. What is the one thing that you want the community, your community, the World War Zero community, anybody watching to do on climate? What is that? Whether it's picking up the litter on the sidewalk, or rigging solar, voting. What is the thing that you want to see us?
Well, so right now the obvious thing is that everyone should vote. I mean, voting is sort of the bare minimum that everyone needs to do right now. Beyond that, I mean, I think World War Zero has quite a few resources for personal living, personal action type thing, but I kind of touched on the biggest ones, which are diet and banking. And that's not to say that you need to go vegan. You can just like cut out a little bit of meat. You can think about the amount of packaging or travel involved in your food. I mean, if you're even just slightly conscientious about your diet, I mean, that still goes some distance. Obviously, like going vegan or going vegetarian probably has the biggest reduction in impact. But like anything is better than nothing. It's like you may as well take some action. And then same with banking. Like think about where your money lives and what that organization is using your money for. Because I mean, most people don't think about that, but while you're sleeping, someone else is using your money in your accounts. And oftentimes they're using it to fund all kinds of projects that you as an individual would never support. And, so it's important that your assets, like whatever you have, are being used in line with your values. But I don't know, those are the things I'd say.
And the last thing I would add to that, I'm obviously an advocate of doing the vote, the bare minimum, as you say. Also, this, talking to your peers and your neighbors and your friends, and in our case, people,
totally.
and acknowledging that this is fundamentally a human issue. This is fundamentally a moral imperative, and it's about incredible progress alongside the pain. And
totally. I think exactly what you're saying, like being willing to engage people in what could be considered a challenging conversation, but doesn't really need to be, because it's like we're all humans living on the same earth. I think that having a willingness to talk to your fellow humans about the way they want the world to go, I think that is important. And I think that Americans, connect on this much more than our political leaders do. You know what I mean? It's like most individuals recognize that there are challenges that the earth are facing. Like even if they don't believe in anthropogenic climate change, they don't believe in like man-caused climate change, they still worry about pollution, they still worry about litter, they still want the natural world to be protected. They just, and so it's worth engaging with them in whatever way you can. It's like, it's always worth chatting with people about the issues and seeing how they feel about them and talking to them about them.
Yeah, like that moment that you mentioned, my conversation with the farmer who was observing climate change in more intimate detail than I ever had, and not using the same terms, but we and we could relate to each other beyond the barriers.
Totally.
So moving beyond the barriers, my Instagram handle, by the way, is Amanda Little Trip. I don't know that I mentioned that in the beginning,
Right.
but shout out to World War Zero for bringing this conversation, bringing it together in this conversation. And Alex, keep chalking up, because we need you to keep to stay safe and keep doing this incredible work you're doing. And I hope to cross paths again.
Yeah, I appreciate it. No, I really enjoyed chatting, and next time we chat, I will have read your book. So,
Good.
looking forward to that too. Right. Yeah, cool.
And I will be continuing to strive as you are toward veganism. It's difficult, but I have to say, with all the meat alternatives that
Totally.
are better and better, it's getting easier and easier.
Totally. And like you said, striving is good enough in a way. It's like you don't necessarily have to go 100%. You just like at least try. That's yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, let's just. I'm like, I could go off on diet for a whole nother talk. Let's just save it for next time when we do a book review for you.
Let's do that. Let's have a conversation on diet next time.
Totally.
And
totally.
We could have the Fate of Food book club, and we'll discuss. Anyway,
yeah, perfect. Cool. Well, thank you all so much. Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for listening, and pleasure chatting, Amanda. And shout out to World War Zero for bringing us together. And thanks everybody. Ciao, ciao.
Shout out. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.